Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, George Bush. These were the former presidents of America in their time. These three Americans attacked 9 countries and killed 11 million people in 23 years, but no one called them war criminals. At first glance, it seems that what they have done is right. Actually, if their actions are correct, al-Qaeda and its leader bin Laden were considered the cause of the September 11th attacks. But why did George Bush attack Iraq in 2001, which is considered an innocent country? The 9/11 attacks were actually just an excuse. In fact, the US knew about the events of September 11th in advance. Knowingly, he could not prevent it. After all, how can the intelligence of the United States, which knows how to move a snake under the ground, remain unaware of this case? In fact, everything turned out according to a different plan. Today we bring to your attention the most sensitive issues in the world and reveal the true faces and goals of the dictators who caused the death of 11 million people. Please don't be indifferent to this video and click like so that it reaches more people. This is important not for us, but for the truth to be decided and the real truth to be revealed to people. Let's start from the beginning. When and how did the US intervention in the Arab countries begin? In 1988, after the end of the Iraq-Iran War, Iraq began to face economic problems. When the country was at war with Iran, it owed a lot of money to Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, and now it had to pay back those debts. War-weary Iraq did not have enough funds to repay those debts. In order to solve this problem, Iraqi President Saddam Hussein takes an aggressive path. He accuses Kuwait of illegally extracting oil from one of the disputed territories, Rumaila, and begins demanding that it pay off $17 billion in debt owed during the Iraq-Iran War and pay another $2.4 billion in reparations. Of course, Kuwait denies this. After that, the war started and Iraq invaded Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, which was watching this situation, became worried, because Iraq also owed money to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, thinking that Iraq will attack us, asks the United States for help to protect itself from Iraq. At this time, Osama bin Laden tells the royal family that non-Muslim countries should not come and interfere in the affairs of Muslim countries, but the royal family rejects this proposal of bin Laden, exiles him and later deprives him of his citizenship. After this incident, the United States begins to interfere in the affairs of Arab countries. The reason is that after the US-Soviet War, the US started deploying its troops to various countries of the world in order to establish its dominance around the world. But despite this, the US was involved in the Vietnam War in 1964 to 1975. After the defeat, the reputation of the United States and its military in the international arena was greatly reduced. The victory in the war against Iraq would restore this confidence to the US military and increase the prestige of the United States among the countries of the world. That is why the USA agreed to the proposal of Saudi Arabia and immediately sent a letter to Iraq with the permission of the United Nations. The letter demanded that Iraq withdraw all its troops from Kuwait. But the Iraqi president at the time, Saddam Hussein, ignored the US demand. As a result, the United States, along with the United Nations, launched an attack on January 17, 1991, and during the Six-Day Offensive, Saddam Hussein announced that he would surrender and withdraw his troops from Kuwait. But because the US and its allies have agreed to attack Iraq by land, they ignore Saddam Hussein's offer of peace and continue to attack. Because George Bush Herbert Walker, who was the 41st President of the United States at that time, was informed about the oil base in Iraq, and George Bush Herbert Walker dreamed of completely defeating Iraq and gaining access to the oil bases. On February 24, 1991, international forces began ground operations against Iraq. On February 27, Kuwait was cleared of Iraqi forces by the Allies, and military operations were now resumed in Iraqi territory. On February 28, Iraq's General Command will raise a white flag, thus ending the war because the UN has passed a total of 12 resolutions against Iraq and demanded economic and military sanctions against Iraq, as well as the immediate withdrawal of troops from Kuwait. Orders to stop. But the US did not like it, and as a result the US tries to continue the war and starts looking for a reason for it. because the goal is to gain access to Iraq's oil bases, and the US will invent lies to continue the war. The 41st President of the USA, George Bush, will take over the oil field in Kuwait, and the Allies will create a strange plot so that the countries of the United States will not find out about this plan of the USA. This is done by the US PR company Hill Knowlton. The company recruits a 15-year-old girl named Naira and teaches her a fictional story about infant mortality. The girl tearfully told the US congressman that the Iraqi soldiers entered the hospital in Kuwait, took the babies from the incubators and threw them on the cold floor, and the babies died there. As a result, these words create a war mood in the American people, and the United Nations does not hesitate to prevent war. Naira's touching story was told several times by George Bush himself when he appeared before the US troops. Actually, the incident was not as Naira said. The deaths of the babies occurred after the US Allied airstrikes on Iraq. According to the New York Times, there will be a blackout after the first bomb is dropped on Iraq. Terrified mothers are forced to take their newborns out of the maternity hospital and keep them alive in the cold basement. In this case, more than 40 children will die. That is, in fact, the USA is the cause of the death of those children, but it blames Iraq to deflect the sin from itself. But as many people find out that this is a lie, the discussion gradually begins to increase. And the UN decides to end the war. As a result, the US military spilled a total of 8 million barrels of oil into the sea, and at that time the main goal of the US became clear to Russia, China, and many other countries. After the war, the United Nations created a special commission under the UN Security Council on the issue of reparations. The task of the commission was to collect compensation for the victims of the invasion of the Iraqi army between August 2, 1990 and March 2, 1991. In 2007, this commission satisfied 1,543,665 complaints from the victims of the war, and a verdict was issued in their favor from the Iraqi government to collect compensation in the amount of $52,386 million. As of June 1, 2007, $22,081 million of the compensation imposed on Iraq will be paid through the fund that collects the funds from Iraqi oil exports opened under the UN. The rest of the compensation will be paid later. Iraq is still paying this compensation, and the saddest thing is that this money is not being paid back to Kuwait because Kuwait does not need it. Kuwaitis are even buying real estate from other countries. As if the people of Iraq have suffered for so many years due to the mistake of the foolish, arrogant President Saddam Hussein, they are now paying reparations, and those who receive these reparations are living 100 times richer than Iraq. During the war against Iraq, there were times when the US continued to attack despite the orders of the United Nations, and as a result of this war, more than 200,000 Iraqis died. Osama bin Laden, who saw this incident at that time, tried many times to stop the United States in order to prevent injustice, but all his attempts were in vain. As a result, bin Laden began to see the United States as his real enemy and planned the events of September 11th. He says about the events of September 11th, "God knows it never occurred to us to attack the towers, but after the situation became unbearable and after we witnessed the injustice and oppression of the American-Israeli alliance against our people in Palestine and Lebanon, I thought about it. And the events that affected me directly were the American invasion of 1982 to 1991 when Iraq surrendered, and what happened after that when America allowed the Israelis to invade Lebanon. The US 6th Fleet helped. As I looked at the towers that were built, I thought of punishing the wrongdoers in the same way, to destroy the towers in America, to make them taste what we taste, our pain, and to stop killing our children and women," says Osama bin Laden. The events of September 11th will take the lives of 3,000 people, and that evening, the 43rd President of the United States, George Bush Jr., will announce, "The White House is confident that Osama bin Laden, the leader of the al-Qaeda terrorist group, is behind the attack on the United States." Our war against terrorism begins with al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. This war will not end until all international terrorist groups are identified, stopped, and defeated, said Bush Jr. in his speech to Congress on September 20th. Senators and members of the House of Representatives applaud the president. This day was the first day Bush Jr.'s dream began to come true. Because his main target was Iraq, the 9/11 attacks were an excuse, and the intention to attack Iraq was given to him by his father, George Bush Herbert Walker, who was the 41st President of the United States from 1989 to 1993. The reason is that George Walker pacified Iraq in the 1991 war at the request of the UN, and the father, who is filled with pain and hatred, plans to fulfill his dream when his son comes to the throne, and they cite the events of September 11th as the reason. But there was a problem. The problem is that America is a democracy and cannot function directly without the opinion of the people. The reason is that every action must be under the control of the people, and if the people do not approve it can have negative consequences and may lead to rebellion. That is why, before the US first launched an attack on Iraq, on January 29, 2002, US President George Bush called Iraq, Iran, and North Korea the line of evil. Such appeals have been used many times in the US foreign policy. Due to the fact that the American people have adopted democratic principles as a basis, the US government cannot freely approach foreign policy without public protest, and it is difficult for it to realize geopolitical goals. That is why the US government often uses the terms good and bad a lot to align public opinion with geopolitical goals. As a result, mass psychology is formed. That is, when many people say that a person is bad, gradually people who do not know about that person also hate him and call him bad because everyone says that he is bad. This is a great psychology, and the US constantly uses this method to its advantage, and according to it, the US government is always in a good position, while the opposing forces, aggressors or preys, are all considered evil forces. Is acknowledged. A clear example of this is when Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil country in the 1980s. According to this policy, the United States presents itself as a good power that spreads civilization and democracy to the world, and this task is also considered a divine mission. Such a worldview is a legacy of the modernization of the Western territories of the United States in the 19th century, and is now widely used in the spread of the United States hegemony in the world. After George Bush's announcement, it became clear that Iraq is the next prey of the United States. Taking advantage of the events of September 11th, the United States called on all its allies to join the war on terrorism. There were no divisions on the issue of Afghanistan. Almost all Western countries supported the intervention to a greater or lesser extent. The United States, which used such unity, expected the same result for Iraq. But soon there was a division not only in the international community, but also among the allies. Unexpectedly, the President of France, Jacques Chirac, said in his speech that the use of force against Iraq will inevitably lead to only the most severe consequences. German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder also says that he cannot be an ally of this intervention. Russia and China also support the Franco-German decisions. But even if many countries are in favor of stopping the war against Iraq, the war started by the United States and NATO forces will not stop. At this point, I will also briefly give necessary information about NATO, which greatly helps America in the destruction of many nations and states. The concept of NATO, known to many of us, was actually founded on April 4, 1949 in America. At that time, 12 countries were members of it, but today 30 countries are members of NATO. NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and many people think that it was created for the purpose of peace. But this error was actually introduced by NATO in order to prevent the Soviet Union from attacking Europe and America and to destroy the Soviet Union from the face of the earth. According to the laws of NATO, its structure could not expand and include other countries. But to date, NATO continues to expand, with 30 member countries. Why does this organization, which was created to protect itself from the Soviet Union, continue to expand after the fall of the Soviet Union instead of disintegrating? Modern politicians commented on this question as follows. The purpose of establishing NATO was to protect the European countries, and it is also written in the NATO statutes. That is, if a non-NATO country invades one of the NATO member countries or starts a conflict on its border, NATO and a United States retaliates against the attacking country and defends its allies. Fearing the Soviet Union, He introduced a secret meeting in 2011 and took NATO, i.e. Europe, as his partner in this meeting. Until this day, European countries have been helping America without knowing it. This makes America stronger in the world. Because the NATO organization, which helps European countries to bow down, is in the shadow of America. If you don't believe, look from 2001 to now. NATO also intervened in the issues of Afghanistan, NATO intervened in the issues of Libya, and NATO took the lead in the issue of Iraq. After all, didn't the NATO statutes say that non-NATO countries will intervene only if they attack NATO countries? That's what it says, but that's only true in the books. In reality, that's what America says. Before you challenge me on my words or make any kind of discussion, please read NATO's constitution and look at its role in real life, and also check the political messages presented to the public by all the media. I didn't make up any news, or I don't intend to make America better with this video. On the contrary, I only want the truth about the world to be decided. I don't want ordinary people to starve and die innocently because of greedy dictators in single quotes. About 6 million Iraqis died and 3 million were maimed because of George Bush's mistake alone. 10 million people became refugees and most of them fled to Syria. And then the war in Syria, which was started by another trick of America, cost about 10,000. The Iraqis returned to their country, but the rest did not because of fear. The United States was also harmed, but this harm occurred only within the United States itself. George Bush was included in the ranks of the worst and worst presidents of the U.S. presidency. The widespread media coverage of the economic plight of the families of fallen soldiers, coupled with the economic crisis, significantly undermined American patriotism. The above certainly shows that the Iraq War brought significant negative consequences for the United States, but for Iraq, this war brought unimaginable negative consequences. The saddest thing is that the Iraqis had nothing to do with the events of September 11. Donald Rumsfeld, who became the head of the Pentagon in 2001, recalled that Bush Jr. asked him 15 days before the September 11 attacks to consider the possibility of opening a war against Iraq. There was no evidence of Saddam Hussein's ties to al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. In October 2002, Illinois politician Barack Obama was invited to speak at an anti-war rally in downtown Chicago. Obama, 41, was eyeing a Senate run at the time, so he was cautious about the offer. On the one hand, there were those on his campaign staff who expressed confidence that a strong condemnation of the war in Iraq would score Obama points and help strengthen his position in the Democratic Party. On the other hand, America has not yet forgotten 9/11, and condemning the war against this background could, on the contrary, undermine his campaign. On the day of the rally, Barack Obama said, "With your permission, I will say from the beginning that even though this is an anti-war rally, I am not a person who is completely against the war." The crowd falls silent. "But I am not against clear plans and a war based on reason, but a war started by emotions," he says. With these words, Obama was trying to gain the public's trust and to hide the stupidity of the president, on the one hand, to preserve the reputation of his political party. But everyone knew that Bush Jr.'s stupid war on Iraq was actually given to emotions and inherited from his father. Millions died because of one family's stupid sentiments, and that stupidity was about to continue, because in May 2015, Republican Jeb Bush was trying to follow in his brother's footsteps and run for president. Bush will come to Reno, Nevada to present his program. He wanted to convince the audience that Barack Obama's decision to withdraw the military from Iraq led to the rise of ISIS. Ivy Zidrick, a 19-year-old student at the University of Nevada, can't wait to meet with Jeb Bush. "You want to say that ISIS appeared because we left the Middle East?" But ISIS arose in response to the actions of the coalition that overthrew the Iraqi government. 100,000 people who served in the Iraqi armed forces lost their positions. They were jobless and penniless, but they had guns. So ISIS was created by your brother. You attack an innocent Iraq and you think Iraq will do nothing to retaliate? Jeb Bush taps the girl on the shoulder and says, "What's the question here?" The little girl says, "I don't need to be taught. You can just answer my question." Jeb Bush says, "Teaching? Look at you." Jeb Bush does not hide his surprise and turns the conversation to Obama again. In this debate, analysts believe that student Ivy Zidrick is right. U.S. military operations have often resulted in high civilian casualties, leading to the radicalization of local populations, especially young people who grew up in a time of war and violence. In addition, the Americans would disband Saddam Hussein's army within an hour, leaving nearly 500,000 well-armed and well-trained soldiers out of a job. Later, most of them become field commanders in ISIS ranks. According to information, ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was also radicalized while imprisoned in the American camp in Bukka. So who is actually breeding the terrorists who are worrying the world today? Isn't America the cause of everything? In the beginning, he attacks the civilians and seizes their wealth. As a result, the citizens take up arms in response to this, and for taking up arms, everyone looks like a terrorist. Until now, because of the American and NATO forces, the negative view of Muslims in Western countries is on the rise. In the eyes of Western countries, all Muslims are terrorists. But in fact, the real terrorists are the officials who rule the USA because of their emotions and greed. Because they caused the death of not thousands, but even millions of innocent people. The end of America, which did not find the main reason to start a war against Iraq, did America, which started the war by deceiving its allies saying that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction and if we do not prevent it, the world is in danger. Did it still achieve its intention? On May 1, 2003, Bush announced his victory. He adds that there is still much work to be done in Iraq, but the tipping point has already been passed. No weapons of mass destruction were found in the country, and no suspicious weapons were found. At this time, representatives of the U.S. Democratic Party in the opposition position begin to criticize Bush, and journalists, who have witnessed great sacrifices and chaos, begin to question the president's administration. On social networks, at that time MySpace was widely used in the USA. The text of Barack Obama's speech at that anti-war rally spread like a virus. As time passes, the situation in Iraq worsens. It's a very strange feeling. I remember thinking at the end of our first trip to Iraq, it worked. I had a feeling that we were all right. Of course, I was only responsible for a small section of northern Iraq, Mosul, and the area south of it. But it seemed to me that we were doing everything right and that our strategy was paying off. Because of this, I was very optimistic when I came to Iraq for the second time, in 2005, and then again in 2006. This time I saw that everything was completely different. The conflicts became more bloody, the situation became more and more complicated, and the population of Iraq grew stronger, and the people, who were full of patience, turned into barbarians, recalls General Hodges. The conflict in Abu Ghraib will cause new attacks on Americans. Bush admits that he made some mistakes in Iraq, but adds that those mistakes can be corrected by sending more troops. In 2007, there were more than 170,000 U.S. troops in Iraq at any one time, not including private military companies hired by the government. At the same time, Barack Obama, who opposes stupid wars, wins the U.S. presidential elections. Although he was initially in favor of reducing the scope of military operations called the War on Terror, in the first years of his administration, the number of American soldiers in Afghanistan only increased and reached 100,000 people. Obama abandons the concept of War on Terror and focuses all his attention on al-Qaeda and the search for bin Laden. In 2010, Barack Obama withdraws the main contingent from Iraq. About 50,000 military personnel will remain in the country. Joe Biden, who was the Vice President of the United States at that time, announced the end of military operations. Barack Obama will try to reduce the participation of the United States and allies in military operations. The contingent will be more involved in training and advising the local military and supporting the local army to be able to defend its country independently. Support is envisaged, says Rose Getmuller, the former Deputy Secretary of State, explaining the position of the Obama administration. With Barack Obama becoming president, the situation may have softened a little compared to George Bush, but it has not stopped completely. Obama was tasked with cleaning up George W. Bush's back, and as a result, July 2013 was particularly deadly for Iraq. More than 100,000 people are reported to have died in the conflict in the past month. This number is the largest indicator since 2008. In addition, the general unrest in the Middle East continued to increase. This does not exclude the possibility that the conflicts will become international. As we all know, the US and UK intervention did not prove that Saddam Hussein's regime produced or possessed any weapons of mass destruction. George W. Bush's mistakes were inherited from his father, and because of those mistakes, he even became president in 1992 by participating in the Democratic Party's presidential election and defeating the Republican Representative George W. Bush and the independent candidate Ross Perot. Clinton also became a victim of these mistakes. Clinton, in turn, intervened in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, causing the death of many people. In 1996, Clinton was re-elected for a second term. During Clinton's presidency, the Social Security system will be reformed, the sale of firearms will be limited, and environmental standards will be strengthened. Clinton continues the path of previous presidents in solving international conflicts in the field of foreign policy. In 1993, with the support of the United States, a peace agreement was signed between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, and in 1994, a similar agreement was signed between Israel and Jordan. In 1995, with the active participation of the United States, agreements were signed to resolve the Bosnian crisis. During the years of the presidency of Bill Clinton, there was growth in the American economy, which increased the welfare of the population. For the first time in 30 years, the country's budget was completed with a surplus. But the scandal revealed in Clinton's leadership in recent years will damage her reputation. A young White House employee, Monica Lewinsky, has revealed her personal relationship with the president. Bill Clinton initially denies it, but later has to admit the connections. In 1998, the impeachment process against him begins. Clinton is charged with perjury and obstruction of justice, but acquitted by the Senate. Well, America has attacked 9 countries and fought for more than 20 years, killed 11 million people, during the 3 most terrible presidents that I mentioned in today's video, but has it achieved its dream? In Iraq, the Americans achieved their main goal. Saddam Hussein was overthrown, but they remained in the country for many more years, which led to the emergence of terrorist organizations in Iraq. In Afghanistan, the Americans did not achieve any of their goals, except for the destruction of Osama bin Laden, the organizer of the September 11 terrorist attacks, in Pakistan. It was not possible to establish democracy in Afghanistan. The task of defeating global terrorism has also not been completed. Power is again in the hands of the Taliban, and the United States hastily evacuated its soldiers and citizens. We have learned to prevent terrorist attacks over the years, and I hope that September 11 and the fate of Iraq and Libya will not be repeated. Thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe to the channel if you find it useful.